everyone! So in this video we'll be picking up where we left off in the last video of Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. I know it's been an awfully long time, so for that I do apologize. I hadn't been taking my meds for a while, and that's because they hadn't been delivered by the post office. Well, the mailman, I think, either put them in the wrong mailbox so somebody else got them, or someone stole them out of my mailbox. But that's neither here nor there. I'm getting back on track with, posting, so videos should be coming out regularly again. So I hope you guys are still with me for this book and still enjoying. Let me know in the comments below what you're thinking and if you're, excited to get back to it. Alright, so that's it for now on the notes, and I'll get to the reading. So, Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. Oh, if I could open it, that would be great. There we go. Alright. Chapter 24. From Hell. Dr. Jonathan Wadsworth's Library, Highgate, 16 October, 1888. "I see you've thrown yourself into another pity party," Thomas said, breezing into Uncle's darkened library. Lifting my head from my book, I noticed his clothing was exceptionally stylish for an afternoon apprenticing with cadavers. His finely stitched jacket fit perfectly to his frame. He caught me inspecting it and grinned. "You've yet to send out invitations, Wadsworth. Rather rude, don't you think?" I ignored both him and his remark, though I knew he was trying to make light of our situation. 8 days had come and gone since we'd spoken with Mr. Lees, and it had been even longer since I'd last seen my father. While I couldn't rely on Mr. Lees' spirit testimony alone, Thomas was moving further down the suspect list every day. He pored over notes and details day and night. I didn't think the stress he tried hiding was an act. Thomas wanted this case solved as badly as I did. During one particularly troubling evening, I shared my fears regarding my father with him. He'd opened his mouth, then shut it, and that was the end of that. His reaction was less than comforting. Staying true to his word, Father didn't seek me out, remaining indifferent to my whereabouts. It was so unlike him, letting me out of his sight for days on end, but he'd become a stranger to me, and I couldn't predict his next moves. I hated thinking or admitting it, but he fit several of Jack the Ripper's emerging characteristics. He'd been present for each crime and absent when Jack had seemingly disappeared for those 3.5 weeks in September. Much as I wanted his opinion, I kept these dark speculations from Nathaniel. Worrying him was unnecessary until I had absolute proof Father was indeed Jack. I flipped through a medical tome, reading over several new notions regarding human psychology and crimes. Father certainly had grief issues and plenty of reason to want organ transplants to be successful. That would explain the missing organs. Though I couldn't see how it'd help Mother now. Then I remembered his favorite tonic, laudanum, might very well explain that delusion. "You shouldn't waste your precious energies on such rubbish, Wadsworth," Thomas said, reading over my shoulder. "Surely you're capable of coming up with theories of your own. You are a scientist, are you not? Or are you saving all the brilliant work for me to come up with?" Thomas smiled at my eye roll, puffing his chest up, and standing with one foot proudly resting on a chair as if posing for a portrait. "I don't blame you. I am rather attractive. The tall, dark hero of your dreams, swooping in to save you with a vast intellect. You should accept my hand at once." "More like overconfident monster haunting my nightmares." I offered him a smirk of my own when he scrunched his nose. He was handsome enough, but he needn't know I thought so. "Haven't you got an organ to weigh, people to annoy, or notes to scribble down for Uncle Jonathan? Or perhaps you've got another patient to experiment on." Thomas grinned wider, folding himself onto the cushioned velvet sofa directly across from me. A fresh body, having nothing to do with the Whitechapel murders for once, was lying on the mortuary table downstairs, waiting to be inspected. First glance said he'd lost his life to the harsh English elements, not to some crazed murderer. Winter was making a few surprise appearances before its official start date. Dr. Wadsworth was called away on more urgent matters. It's just the two of us, and I'm quite bored of your moping about. We could be taking full advantage of our time together, but no." He sighed dramatically. You're intently reading rubbish." I nestled into my oversized reading chair and flipped to the next page. "Studying the psychological states of humans and how they may or may not relate to deeper psychotic issues is hardly moping about. Why don't you put that big brain to use and read some of these studies with me?" "Why don't you talk to me about what's really troubling you? What emotional dilemma needs sorting out?" He patted his legs. "Sit here and I'll rock you gently until you or I both fall asleep." I tossed the book on the floor at his feet, then immediately cringed. I was about to tell Thomas I was absolutely not struggling with any emotional issues and had shown him differently. One day I'd rein my cursed actions in. I sighed. "I cannot stop thinking my father's the man stalking the night." "The moral dilemma being what, exactly?" Thomas asked. "Whether or not you should turn dear old father in to the authorities?" "Of course that's the moral dilemma," I exclaimed, incredulous at how obtuse he was. "Ooh, sorry. I forgot to put my phone onto a, vibrator silent. Sorry." I exclaimed, incredulous at how obtuse he was when it came to basic human concepts. "How can one turn against their blood? How can I send him to his death? Surely you must realize that's precisely what would happen if I told authorities." "They'd hang father. Given who he was, they'd make it as public and brutal as possible. Just because blood might stain his hands did not mean I wanted his on mine, no matter if it was right or wrong. Not to mention," I added aloud, "it would kill my brother." I covered my face with my hands. I was not saying the most obvious thing. Not turning my father in would result in more women being slain. It was a horrible predicament to be in, and I hated father even more for subjecting me to it. Thomas grew very quiet, staring at his own hands. An eternity stood waiting, watching along with me until he banished it from our presence. "What are you hoping to discover between the pages of other men's theories?" "Redemption, clarity, a cure for the demon infecting my father's soul. If there was some way for me to address the issues with his brain, perhaps he could be saved." I listened to the silence stretching between us, the ticking of the clock echoing my own heart's beat. I lowered my voice. "If it were your father, wouldn't you try anything to save him, especially after already losing one parent? Perhaps it isn't too late for his salvation." Thomas swallowed hard, casting his attention to my book. "Will you be using a prop, such as religion, to deliver him from his sins, then? Sprinkle a bit of holy water and burn the devil out of him? I thought that was your eccentric aunt's domain." I bent down to retrieve the medical journal, turning back to the last section I'd read. The leather chair squeaked as I shifted my weight. "I am a scientist, Thomas. Father's salvation will come in the form of tonics working on his physiology. There are great treatises about the effect of chemicals on the neurological pathways of the brain," I said, pointing out one of them in the book. "Plus, I'll threaten to imprison him in our home. I'll keep him in chains, locked in his own study if he doesn't agree to have his mind evaluated." Thomas shook his head. We both knew that was a lie. A weak knock came at the door before he could respond. We both stared at the footman standing half in and half out of in the hall and half inside the library, a flush creeping up his collar. I hoped he hadn't been lingering there long. If anyone learned of father's potential identity as Jack the Ripper, or the fact that we'd suspected him and hadn't turned him in, we'd all be in a world of trouble ourselves. "Dr. Wadsworth has requested your presence at Scotland Yard immediately, miss." When Thomas and I shot each other glances, he amended, "Both of you." I didn't care what I looked like to the men standing around Superintendent Blackburn's desk, as I covered my mouth with the back of my lace-gloved hand. The stench assaulting my senses was almost as bad as what the package contained, possibly worse. I could deal with most anything gruesome and bloody. Rotten meat, however, was something I feared I'd never get used to, no matter how many times I was forced into contact with the foul substance. "Most certainly it's half a human kidney," Uncle confirmed, though no one had asked. "While it's impossible to tell for sure, we must put some validity to the letter that came with it. Miss Eddowes was missing a kidney. This is a human kidney. From the state of the decay, it was taken around the same time as hers was, and it's from the left side, same as our victim. I'll have to examine it further in my laboratory, but from sight alone there seem to be some similarities. I swallowed my disgust down. Jack was coming undone, it seemed. Thomas passed the newest note from the murderer to me, averting his gaze as he did so. I wondered if he'd tell the police about my father. I wondered if I'd do the same if I were standing in his place. Guilt retched itself deep in my gut. Was I allowing sentimentality to stand in the way of justice? That made me as bad as the Ripper. Except, what if police had already discovered the identity? I stole a glance at Superintendent Blackburn. I knew nothing of him, really, and remained wary in his presence. Perhaps he'd already seen this organ the night it was removed from its owner. He was rather stone-faced, given what my uncle was saying, which made me wonder if Father committed these acts himself, or if it had been Blackburn carrying out his dark deeds. Was his squeamish reaction at the double event a mere act of deception? I shook myself out of spiraling thoughts, relieved no one was paying me any mind. The letter was written in the same taunting red ink as the other 2 notes Jack had sent. I'd recognized that cursive in my nightmares. I'd gone over it so many times trying to find similarities to my father's own hand. Oh dear, it's another one of those scrolly, scripty writing letters from Stell. I don't know. Mr. Lusk. Sor. S-O-R, I don't know. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you together, for you to their piece. I fried and ate it. It was very wise. It was very nice. No, wise. Yeah, wise. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can. Mr. Lusk. I have no idea. I'm sorry. These things are so hard to read. Anyway. George Lusk was my brother's friend and also happened to be the loudest member of the vigilante group Nathaniel was part of, the Knights of Whitechapel. If Father was indeed Jack the Ripper, sending someone close to our family a piece of evidence was rather brazen. Then again, claiming to have eaten the other half of the human kidney sounded as though insanity had taken over him. Cannibalism was a new low for the Whitechapel murderer. I laid the letter back on Blackburn's cluttered desk. The cursive didn't look like Father's, but that didn't mean he hadn't taken pains to disguise it. Perhaps whatever evil dwelt inside him had its own handwriting. I wonder, I said aloud, not meaning to. Thomas motioned for me to speak, but I wasn't quite ready to. Thoughts and theories were taking shape and forming in my mind. Perhaps if I offered something up, I could study Blackburn's reaction for deceit. A few seconds later, I began again. Seems a bit odd, don't you think? No, Wadsworth, Thomas said blandly. Sending a kidney through the mail is quite ordinary. I do it at least 3 times a week to remain fashionable. You ought to try it. Really impress the girls at tea. I made a face at him. What I mean is, let's say he's been killing women and trying to perform an organ transplant. Why eat her kidney at all? Wouldn't that be a waste of a harvested organ? Blackburn's color drained as if he were about to be sick. His reaction appeared genuine enough, but he'd fooled me before. He ran a hand through his hair. It's barely 2 o'clock, and I swear I already could use a pint. Is that what you think, Dr. Wadsworth? Jack is using human organs to transplant or sell? Uncle stared at the box, nodding absently. I have a suspicion I cannot shake. Uncle took his spectacles off, wiping them on the front of his jacket before securing them back on his face. I fear he might have taken an extra kidney, but realized he didn't need it, then decided to keep it from going to waste. A shudder racked my body. If Father was Jack the Ripper, where was he keeping the organs? It's not as if they could be stored in jars in our icebox without the cooks and maids seeing them. Was that the true reason why he'd never dismissed Martha, our cook? Was she privy to his monstrous secrets? The thought of having slept in the same house where this kind of horror could have been taking shape a few rooms away was too much. Blackburn walked around his desk, dropping into the chair behind it and rubbing his eyes. Perhaps running the estate as my father had wanted isn't such a bad idea. I can handle a vast amount, but this is a bit much. How horrid can a life of leisure and politics be? Thomas ignored the superintendent, seeking my uncle's opinion out again. He narrowed his eyes, his angular features sharpening his every thought. Are you saying he's finished with the killings, then? Uncle shook his head, and parts of my skin tried crawling away from my body. He had that bleak look in his eye, the one that spoke of worse things to follow. When he started touching his mustache, I wasn't at all surprised by his next words. I believe there's one final thing he's in need of. Then the murders may stop. A police officer walked over to Superintendent Blackburn and handed him a file, whispering some message in his ear before departing as quickly as he'd come. Whatever he said couldn't have been too important, as Blackburn tossed the paper onto the desk and fixed his gaze back on Uncle. I'm not sure I want to hear any more, Dr. Wadsworth, but I'm afraid I do not have the luxury of ignorance. Do enlighten us. I don't know how, but I knew, with more certainty than I had any right to, exactly what Jack the Ripper was missing. It'd be the most impressive organ to transplant or steal. The words nearly gagged me on their way out, but I said them anyway. A heart. He'll need a heart before he's through butchering women. I felt Thomas staring at me, his gaze searching a hole through my conviction to remain silent, but couldn't meet his eyes for fear I'd confess everything I suspected to the police right then and there, consequences be damned. But the one thread of hope I held fast to was that Uncle hadn't mentioned a thing about Father to police either. I'd told him my suspicions last night in the laboratory, and though he was even more skeptical than I was, his face had paled. Uncle told me not to worry, that we'd uncover the truth soon enough. That Father was simply unwell and everything mounting up against him only a coincidence. Seeing the truth was never easy, especially when it revealed those closest to us could be monsters hidden in plain sight. If Uncle could hang on to a single string of belief, unraveling as quickly as it might be, that Father was innocent, then so could I, for now. Chapter 25. A violet from Mother's grave. Dr. Jonathan Wadsworth's residence, Highgate, 8 November 1888. I pulled the tattered navy dress from a trunk in Uncle's attic. Its stitches were coming loose at the seams, and the smell of must filled the space as I shook it out in the pale moonlight. There was no hope of making it fashionable. Too much time and not enough care had passed since it was first worn by Miss Emma Elizabeth. Uncle had gathered nearly all her belongings from a family no longer wanting to be associated with her, taking pains to leave things as she had, frozen in time as if they were captured in a photograph, except with a thick covering of dust and a few too many hungry moths, having had a fine dining experience over the last several years. The dress was a little too old, a little too ragged, and a bit too big. If I were to wear this ghastly dress out, I'd look as if I belonged in the East End begging for work to feed my addictions, and Aunt Amelia would surely perish on the spot. I doubted even Liza would be able to make it pretty. It was absolutely perfect. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me in that silent, calculating way that drove me mad. I don't see sense in what you're doing, Wadsworth. Why not confront your father and be done with it? Sneaking about like a prostitute is by far the worst idea you've ever come up with. Congratulations, he said, unlatching his arms and clapping slowly. You've achieved something more memorable, even if it's ridiculous. I've almost crossed you off my suspect list. I shook out another dull dress. Dust tickled my nose as I laid it down. In its day, the deep green silk must have been grand. That's quite an achievement. Oh, yes, he said, rolling his eyes. Another of your fine ideas. As if I'd be messy enough to leave an evidence behind. I'm with you practically day and night. Does that not absolve me from being a murderer? Or must we share a bed to prove my innocence? Actually, that might not be a terrible idea. Ignoring him, I removed a pair of brown lace-up boots from the same leather trunk and inspected them closely. They looked to be around my size, so I added them to my costume pile. Thomas had started following me around 2 hours prior, milling about and offering up his opinions like sacrifices I didn't care to accept. We've done things your way for 3 solid weeks, I reminded him, earning us nothing but mounds of frustration. Enough is enough, Thomas. We tried hiding outside my house on Belgrave Square, camping out at all hours of the night, all times throughout the day, but never succeeded in catching father coming or going. I'd even gone as far as etching his carriage for identification purposes, should we ever see it rolling about at night. It was as if he always knew when he was being watched, sensed it like a wolf being tracked by something mad enough to hunt it. Now it was time to test my theory out. For your information, I said, holding the green dress up, I am not going as a prostitute. I'm simply blending in. No amount of discussion would dissuade me from the path I'd chosen. If I couldn't catch father heading into Whitechapel, I'd plant myself there and wait for him to come to me. It was as fine an idea as any. One way or another, I was determined to figure out if father was Jack the Ripper. Thomas muttered something too quiet for me to hear, then marched to an armory, standing solemnly in the corner of the attic, yanking the doors marched to an armoire standing solemnly in the corner of the attic, yanking the doors open and rummaging through it with a vengeance. "What in the name of the Queen are you doing?" I asked, though he didn't bother answering. Clothes flew over his shoulders as he tossed them out of his way, searching for something that fit his needs. If you'll not be reasoned with, I shall have to sneak about with you. Clearly I'll need an old overcoat and trousers." He made a sweeping motion over his person. "No one in their right mind will think me an East End resident looking as wonderful as I do. I may even don a wig." "I am not in need of a haughty escort this evening." I scowled, even though he wasn't looking. "I'm quite capable of taking care of myself." "Oh, yes. How silly of me to overlook that," Thomas snorted. "I imagine the women who lost their organs thought themselves quite above being slaughtered as well. They were likely saying, 'It's Friday. I shall go to the pub, find a bit of food, pay my board, then get murdered by a madman before the night's through. How lovely.'" "He is my father," I said through clenched teeth. "You honestly believe he'll harm me? I do not think even he has a heart so black and rotten." Thomas finally stopped flipping through the moth-eaten overcoats, turning his attention to me. His expression was thoughtful for a moment. "If Jack the Ripper is your father, you still haven't found definitive proof. You're basing all your bravado on the assumption you are indeed related to this monster," he said. "I do not think you incapable, Audrey Rose, but I do know he's murdered women who were alone. What exactly do you think you'll do if you discover you're wrong and there's a knife pressed against your throat?" He moved across the room so fast I barely had time to register the object against the sensitive skin covering my throat. Thomas kissed my cheek, then slowly drew back, our eyes meeting. My heart hammered a panicked beat when his attention fell to my lips and lingered there. I couldn't tell if I wanted to kiss him or kill him. Finally, he stepped back, letting the candle clatter to the floor, then picked up a crude walking stick as if nothing had happened. "Interesting," he murmured, admiring the stick. "Kill him, then. I definitely wanted to murder him." I clutched my throat with both hands, breathing hard. "Have you lost your mind? You could have killed me!" "With a candle?" His brow quirked up. "Honestly, I'm flattered you think me so capable. Alas, I highly doubt I could do much damage with such a weapon." "You know what I mean," I said. "If it were a knife, I'd be dead." "Precisely the point of our little exercise, Wadsworth." He didn't sound or appear the least bit sorry for scaring the life out of me. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring me down. "Stubborn mule. Imagine yourself alone in the East End," he said. "Freezing like that would have cost you your life. You must be quick to action, always thinking your way out of any predicament. It all boils down to your blasted emotions clouding your judgment. If I were to do it again, what might you do differently?" "Stab you with the heel of my boot." Thomas's shoulders relaxed. I hadn't noticed the tension in them until it was gone. "Good. Now you're using that alluring brain of yours, Wadsworth. Step on the insole of someone's foot as hard as you can. There are so many nerve endings it'll be a decent enough distraction, buying valuable time." His gaze traveled over me swiftly. It was more an assessment of my attire than a flirtation, but my cheeks heated all the same. "Now then, let's get you ready for a casual night of street walking and be gone. Oh, you can thank me for preparing you any time now," he said, struggling to keep the smile off his face. "I wouldn't protest a kiss on the cheek, return the favor and all." I glared so hard I feared my face would get stuck that way. "If you ever try anything like that again, I will stab you in the foot, Thomas Cresswell." "Ah, there's something about saying my "There's something about you saying my name that sounds like a blessed curse," he said. "If you can work up a good hand gesture to go along with it, that'd be exceptional." I threw a boot across the room, but he'd managed to slip out and close the door before it made contact. I set my jaw, loathing him with each beat of my heart. Though he was right, I needed to be more emotionally prepared for my date with Jack. I walked over to the door, picked up the boot, and began dressing. The clouds were rolling in, covering the last sliver of the moon. It was the perfect night to hunt a murderer on the streets of Whitechapel. "Why in God's name are you walking with a limp?" I whispered harshly at my idiotic companion, throwing cautious looks at people staring across the street. "You're causing a dreadful scene, and we're supposed to be inconspicuous." Thomas had adopted the Anzian lame leg the same time we reached the outer edges of Spitalfields. We'd been arguing about his acting the last few streets, garnering more attention than the Queen parading through the squalor in her most expensive attire. Thomas was undeterred by looks and jeers we received. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying himself. "You're simply upset you didn't think of doing it first. Now go on and stumble a bit. If you don't act intoxicated, we'll never attract the Ripper." He looked down his nose at me, a smile starting. "Feel free to hold on to me. My arms are all yours." I grabbed a handful of my skirt, sidestepping rubbish that had been dumped in the gutters, thinking the heavens Thomas couldn't see my blush. "You've gone and missed the entire point of this evening. I am not trying to lure the Ripper out, Thomas," I said. "I'm trying to blend in and stalk him. See where he's going and stop him from committing another murder. He'll take one look at us and run in the other direction, lest the lame-legged boy chase him with his walking stick. It is a cane, and it is quite a handsome cane. The Ripper should be too pleased to be assaulted by such a work of rustic art." I glanced at the walking stick. It was barely even polished and had cobwebs stuck to its grooves. It was rustic indeed. Silently, we crept through the back alleys and squared-off yards, looking for any hulking shadows, listening for any blood-curdling screams. It was hard to see anything, though. The night sky was nearly black as ink, no flickering light shined down for us, and what little did from gas lamp-posts was quickly followed by a thick fog. We passed through one dark alleyway, hobbled across another street, and paused in front of a decrepit pub full of discordant music and laughter. Drunken women draped themselves over the men standing outside, their voices louder and rougher than those of the butchers. Sailors and iron workers there were trying to entice. I wondered briefly at their lives before prostitution. It was such an unfair, cruel world for women. If you were a widow, or your husband or family disowned you, there were few avenues available for feeding yourself. It hardly mattered if you were high-born or not. If you couldn't rely on someone else's money and shelter, you survived the only way you could. "Let's go," I said, turning as quickly as I dared. I needed to get away from these women and their tragic lives before my emotions got the better of me. Thomas eyed the women, then glanced at me. I knew very well he was seeing more than I wanted him to, and didn't want him thinking me fragile. To my surprise, he simply threaded my arm through his, a silent act of understanding. My heart steadied. It was such a tiny action, but filled me with confidence in Thomas. Jack the Ripper would never show such compassion. We ghosted through several more streets, emerging from the fog before hiding in its sanctity once more. Voices carried over to us, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Men talked about their day's work, women chattered about the same. Thomas gave up his limp the longer we pressed on, having no reason for gimping about when people couldn't even see us. Gas lamps offered otherworldly glows every few feet, their quiet hissing raising the hair along my neck. The mood of the night was ominous. Death was stalking these streets, staying just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but heard no sounds of pursuit and accepted I was simply scared. "Enough," I said, defeated. "Let's go home." It was after midnight, and I was exhausted. My feet ached, the rough material of my dress itched against my skin, and I was thoroughly finished with walking through all the muck. I'd stepped in something rather squishy a few streets back and was contemplating amputating my own foot. Blessedly, Thomas didn't say a word as we turned and headed toward Uncle's house. I wouldn't have taken his criticism well in the miserable state I was in. Lost in thoughts of failure, I didn't hear a sound until our attacker was upon us. A scuffle of boots on cobblestones, the sound of a punch landing true, and Thomas was face down on the ground, a bulky man kneeling on his back, twisting his arm around. "Thomas!" Someone else emerged, holding a blade to my throat, shoving me deeper into the alleyway. I tripped over my skirts, but the man wrenched me forward, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. Fear held my senses hostage. My mind shut down, unable to process what was going on. Was this Jack? "What you got here, boy? Been following you, I been. Think you yourself clever, distressin' like a riffraff?" The man speaking to Thomas had breath that smelled of rotten teeth and too much alcohol. "Shame. I have to take from you same as you took from me." From the ground Thomas jerked around, his eyes frantic as they fell upon mine. His attacker shoved his face into the stone. My limbs were leaden and useless. "I assure you, I have not taken from you, sir." Thomas winced as the man forced his head back down. "Whatever your issue with me, leave the girl go. Leave the girl go. She's done nothing." "Ain't how I see it." The man spat next to Thomas. "Think taking them from the cemetery is decent? Poor deserve respect too, my Libby." His hand shook, the blade piercing my skin. "She didn't deserve to be cut up like that. You had no right. I know what you done. Oliver told me himself." A sob broke free of the man's chest. A slight trickle of blood ran down my neck. Its warmth cleared my frozen thoughts. If I didn't act now, we were going to die, or be maimed. Neither was on my list this evening. Remembering Thomas's lesson on dealing with an attack, I lifted my foot and stomped down with all my might. My heel crunched bone with a snap. It was enough of a distraction, just like Thomas said it'd be. "Bloody hell!" The man stumbled away, jumping on his good foot. Thomas's attacker eased up long enough to watch his friend, allowing Thomas time to flip over and land a swift punch into his gut. The man doubled over, cursing impressively. Springing to his feet, Thomas grabbed hold of my hand, racing us through the twisted streets, as if Satan himself was chasing us down. We moved in and out of passageways and alleys, running so fast I had to eventually tug Thomas to stop. "What was he talking about?" Thomas held on to me as if I might turn to ash and disintegrate in his hands as he let go. He glanced up and down the alley as we hid in, his chest rapidly rising and falling. There was a wild, untamed look in his eyes. I'd never seen him so unraveled. On the inside I felt the same, but hoped I was doing a better job hiding it. I took a steadying breath. Thomas was a complete wreck. I gently touched his face, drawing his attention to me. "Thomas? What? I thought I was going to lose you." He ran both hands through his hair, pacing away and coming back. "I saw blood. I thought he'd slit your throat. I thought—" He covered his face with his hands, collecting himself for a few breaths, then fixed his attention to me, swallowing hard. "You must know what you mean to me. Surely you must know how I feel about you, Audrey Rose. The thought of losing you." I'm not sure which of us moved first, but suddenly my hands were cradling his face and our lips were crashing together. Propriety and polite society be damned. There was no Jack the Ripper or midnight attack. There was just Thomas and me, terrified of losing each other. I wove my arms around his neck, drawing him closer. Before I wanted it to end, Thomas pulled back, kissing me sweetly one last time. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, pressing his forehead to mine. "Apologies, Miss Wadsworth." I touched my lips. I'd read about dangerous situations bringing about spontaneous acts of romance and thought it foolish. Now I understood. Realizing the very thing you love most could be taken away without warning made you clutch onto it. I believe I acted first, Thomas. He stepped back, wrinkling his brow, then laughed. "Oh, no, I'm not at all sorry about kissing you. I'm talking about the deranged lunatic holding a knife to your throat." "Oh, that." I waved a hand, feigning nonchalance. "He's lucky you had the foresight of preparing me this evening." Thomas's eyes twinkled with a mixture of amusement and incredulity. "You're truly magnificent, smashing bones and fighting off attackers in abandoned alleys." "It's too bad," I said. "Your reputation will be completely ruined once people discover I saved you." "Destroy it for all I care." Thomas laughed outright. "You can save me again if it ends with a kiss." "Did you know," I asked, turning serious, "about the cadavers?" His jaw clenched. Thomas carefully took my hand, motioning for us to keep moving. Unfortunately, I did not. Obviously, the bodies aren't unclaimed, or as Oliver says. I do not appreciate being lied to or researching on someone's family member without permission. No advancement in science is worth causing pain. I let go a sigh I was holding. It was all I needed to hear. Thomas was most certainly not involved in the Ripper crimes. He was interested in saving lives, not ending them. "What will you do about Oliver?" I asked. "He cannot continue lying about the bodies. I doubt you're the only one he's done this to." "Oh, I'll be having words with him, believe me." Thomas pulled me close. I despise having you put you in unnecessary danger. We are stalking Jack the Ripper, I pointed out. I'm already putting us in danger. Thomas shook his head, mirth replacing tension, but didn't say more. Intent on leaving the East End, we trudged across Dorset Street, our attention scattered from the attack, and when I nearly walked straight into a hansom cab. A hansom cab. I stopped, staring in disbelief. Incredibly, the night took a larger turn for the worse. A snake coiled around my torso, striking at my innards. A scratch ran down the side of the cab in an unmistakable M, a feature I was very familiar with, as I'd made it myself last week. It was my identification of a murderer. This carriage belonged to my father. Okay, so that was the end of chapter 25. We will pick up on chapter 26 in the next video. I hope you guys are enjoying this book so far. Let me know what you think. We will be getting in the next video to the last hidden mystery gift in this book. So, yay, that'll be exciting. Okay, without further ado, that's Reading by Irene. Until next time, bye!